My father sold the house I inherited and claimed that the money would be used to cover my brother's vacation. I laughed a week later when my legal advisor called me. Honestly, I thought my father was joking when he said that amount would go toward my brother's vacation after selling the house I inherited. I even laughed. But a week later, when my lawyer called, the laughter faded. That house meant everything to me. It wasn't just an asset from my grandmother's will, it was where I spent most of my childhood, where I felt safe when things got complicated with my parents. My grandmother was the only one in the family who truly cared about me. She practically raised me while my parents were too absorbed in their own lives and excessively focused on my younger brother, Adam. She was the one who was always there for me, who made me feel like I mattered. And when she passed, she left me her house. I wasn't surprised my parents rarely visited her, never lifted a finger to help when she was sick. Adam, their spoiled son, didn't care either. He was too busy doing nothing. At 24 years old, he still lived at home, unemployed, but somehow overflowing with potential in my father's eyes. I had always accepted that I was the neglected son, the one who had to fight alone. But I never imagined it would come to this. One afternoon, I decided to drive by the house, just to look at it. I hadn't moved and I already had my own place, but it comforted me to know it was there, waiting for me. But when I arrived, something felt off. There were cars parked outside. Not mine, not my grandmother's, someone else's. I walked to the door and rang the bell. A few seconds later, a man in his late 30s opened the door, with a woman standing behind him. They looked confused. "Can I help you?" the man asked. I frowned. "Yes. This is my house." "Who are you?" The woman let out a nervous little laugh. "We bought this house last month from the previous owner." I felt as if my stomach had been twisted into a knot. "What?" The man crossed his arms. "We purchased it legally." "What's the problem?" My mouth went dry. I looked at them, at their cars, at the porch that was no longer mine, and I could barely process it. I pulled out my phone, checked my emails and messages. Nothing. No alerts, no notifications of any sale. But I already had a feeling of what had happened. I didn't say another word. I simply turned around, got in my car, and drove straight to my parents' house. Adam was the only one home, lying on the couch, staring at his phone. He barely looked up when I walked in. "What's up?" he mumbled. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Where are Mom and Dad?" He shrugged. "Why?" I clenched my fists. "Because they sold my house." Adam blinked. "Oh. Yeah." He nodded, as if it was some trivial fact. "They'll be back soon." Then he went back to looking at his phone. I stood there, staring at him, while he didn't care at all. So I waited. When my parents finally arrived, I didn't even let them sit down. "What the hell did you do?" My father sighed, as if I were the problem. "Look, Hubert, it wasn't fair for you to keep the house. Your mother and I had other plans." "Plans?" I repeated. "So you forged documents and sold my house?" My father continued, completely indifferent. Adam needed a vacation. He needed a vacation. I almost laughed again, but this time, there was no humor in it. I shook my head. "I'm not going to let this happen." I turned and walked out, because my father had no idea what was coming. I barely remember how I got home. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. I could still hear my father's voice in my mind, calm and condescending, as if he hadn't just scammed me, as if it wasn't a big deal. Adam needed a vacation. Adam needed a car. Meanwhile, my grandmother's house, the only real refuge I ever had, was gone. I parked in front of my apartment and sat there for a while. I wasn't going to let it go. But I also wasn't going to act without a plan. My father was arrogant, but he wasn't an idiot. If he had done this, he had to have covered his tracks. So I called my friend Daniel. Daniel was a lawyer, and not just a good one, he was ruthless. If there was even the slightest hint of fraud in the sale, he would find it. I told him everything over the phone, and by the time I was done, he was furious. "Meet me at my office tomorrow," he said. "Bring everything: emails, documents, messages. I don't care if it's a birthday card from your grandmother. If it mentions the house, I want it." I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept replaying everything: my grandmother's voice, my father's smug smile, Adam's indifference. And beneath it all, one single thought. They think they've won. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I met with Daniel at his office and handed him every document I had: my grandmother's will, bank statements, even old messages in which she expressed how much she wanted the house to be mine. Daniel examined the documents for a while, then leaned back in his chair. "Your father is an idiot," he finally said. I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Why?" "Because he didn't just commit fraud, he left a paper trail." Daniel turned his monitor toward me and showed me something I didn't expect: a forged signature. My signature. I leaned in. "Wait. That's not mine." Daniel nodded. "Your father faked your consent for the sale. And he did it with a notary who has already been investigated for shady dealings. This is bad for him. Really bad." I exhaled slowly. "So what's the plan?" Daniel snapped his fingers. "First, we send a formal demand. We give them the chance to return the money before we take them to court. But based on what you've told me about your father, I doubt he'll cooperate." "Not a chance," I said. "Then we sue. And if he can't pay, we go after his assets, his house, his savings, everything." I nodded, feeling something I hadn't in a long time: satisfaction. "Let's do it." I knew my father wouldn't return the money. He was too arrogant to admit he had done anything wrong. To him, I had always been a problem, an obstacle in his perfect vision of a family, where Adam was the golden child and I was just an inconvenient afterthought. But this time, he had made a mistake too big to ignore. And I was going to make sure he paid for it. That same day, Daniel drafted the formal notice. He sent it by email, by mail, and even made sure a court officer delivered it in person. I almost wished I could have been there to see my father's face when he received it. But I already knew what his reaction would be: contempt. Maybe even laughter. He thought he could treat me like I was nothing, without consequences. He thought he would get away with it. 2 days later, I got a call. It was my mother. "Hubert, why are you doing this?" she asked, exasperated. I pressed the phone against my ear. "Do you really want me to explain it to you?" "It's just a house," she insisted. "Your father and I made that decision because we thought it was the right thing to do. You already have your own apartment, Hubert. You didn't need that house." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to contain my anger. "Didn't need it?" I repeated. "You're talking about the house where I grew up. The house my grandmother left me because she knew you two never cared about me. And you sold it to fund Adam's vacation. Does that sound normal to you?" "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," I cut her off. "You forged my signature. That's a crime." She was silent for a moment. And in that pause, I knew she realized I was right. But in the end, she just sighed and muttered, "You've always been so dramatic." I hung up. There was nothing left to discuss. The deadline to respond to the notice passed without my father making any attempt to settle. No surprise, really. He thought I wouldn't have the guts to take this further. So Daniel filed the lawsuit. The reaction didn't take long. The next day, Adam sent me a message. "Adam, are you seriously suing your own family over an old house? How ridiculous." I let out a humorless laugh. Adam, who had never had to fight for anything in his life, thought I was overreacting. He had no idea what it felt like to have the one thing that truly mattered to you ripped away. I didn't reply. He didn't deserve an answer. But my father didn't stay silent. By the end of that week, Daniel received an email from my father's lawyer, a mediocre professional, probably a family friend who took the case to intimidate us. The email said something like, "My client denies all accusations. The property was sold legally, and any attempt to contest the sale will be treated as harassment and defamation." I showed the email to Daniel. He read it, rolled his eyes, and let out a laugh. "He's lying. If he were so sure, he would have already presented documents proving the sale was legitimate. But he can't because the signature is fake." So we proceeded with the lawsuit. No doubt about it. The following days were miserable. My parents started telling the entire family that I was destroying them. I got messages from uncles, cousins, even acquaintances, telling me I was taking things too far. "It's just a house. It's your father. Family is more important than money." But no one asked why he did this to me. No one cared how I felt. To them, I was the villain. And then the bombshell. Daniel obtained a crucial document, the house's sales contract, with my forged signature. He requested a forensic analysis. The result was clear. The signature wasn't mine. Not only had my father committed fraud, but he had done so with shocking negligence. That was enough to escalate the case. Now, on top of the civil lawsuit, we had enough proof to file criminal charges against him. The day of the first hearing, I saw my father in court for the first time since all of this began. He was sitting next to his lawyer, looking annoyed, as if this was all a waste of time. My mother didn't show up. Neither did Adam. The judge started the session. My father's lawyer tried to argue that there was no solid evidence of fraud. Daniel, without saying a word, simply handed over the forensic report. The judge reviewed it for a few seconds, then looked at my father. "Sir, can you explain why your son's signature appears to be forged?" My father's face turned red. He started rambling about administrative errors and misunderstandings, but the judge wasn't convinced. The hearing ended with the court ordering a full review of all financial documents related to the sale. That meant that if my father was hiding anything, and I knew he was, we would soon find out. As we left the courthouse, my father finally broke his silence and approached me. "Do you think you've won something?" he growled. "This won't end well for you, Hubert." I crossed my arms. "No, Dad. The one who thought he could get away with everything is you. But it's over." He stared at me for a moment, then walked away. That night, I sat in my apartment and let it all sink in. There was still a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. 2 weeks later, we received the official notice. The court had recognized the fraud and annulled the sale of the house. The property would be returned to me. And my father was ordered to pay me compensation. The best part? He had no money. Which meant he would have to sell his house to pay off his debt. When he found out, I received one last message. "Dad, you've destroyed your own family. I hope you're satisfied." I stared at the screen for a moment. And I smiled. I had never been happier. My father always thought he was untouchable. He lived convinced that he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. But now he was trapped. I had already won my house back. But fate had one last surprise for him. A few days after winning the case, Daniel called me. His voice had a hint of amusement, something rare for him. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Tell me, was my father arrested?" "Your father?" Daniel chuckled. "Not yet. But the buyers of your house are suing him." I went silent for a moment. "What?" They're demanding compensation. They say they were deceived that your father sold them a property without the proper documentation, and now they've lost the house they legally purchased. I let out a low laugh. It wasn't a laugh of humor. It was pure satisfaction. Finally, something fair in this world. Daniel continued, you've got a solid case. Your father is going to have to pay them a hefty sum. And if he doesn't have the money... That single word was enough to make me smile genuinely for the first time since this all began. When I returned to my house to start organizing my things, I found the former buyers. The couple who had moved in was there, packing up their belongings. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. I knew they weren't responsible for my father's scam. They had simply bought a house without knowing the truth. But I wasn't responsible for what happened either. The woman was the first to approach me. You're the real owner, aren't you? I nodded. She sighed, looking tired but not resentful. Look, we just want you to know we don't hold anything against you. We know you were deceived just like we were. Her husband stepped forward, crossing his arms. Your father, on the other hand, we hope he ends up ruined. I let out a short laugh. I could agree with that. They explained that they were suing my father for financial and emotional damages. They had invested a lot in the purchase, the move, the renovations they had started, only for it all to be in vain. Now, they were left without a house and without the money they had put into it. It's not your fault, the man said. But someone has to pay. I nodded slowly. And he will. Every last cent. They packed up their last boxes, said their goodbyes, and left. Even though we didn't really know each other, I felt a mutual respect. They didn't see me as an enemy, and I completely understood why they were suing my father. Now, with my house finally back, I could breathe. It felt strange being there after everything that had happened. I walked through the rooms, feeling the weight of every memory. The scent was the same. The sound of the wind against my bedroom window was still familiar. It was as if the house had been waiting for me all this time. I have no regrets. My entire family now saw me as a traitor. My mother hadn't called me since the last time we spoke. Adam, as expected, posted ridiculous indirect messages on social media about how envy destroys families and how money can't buy love. I laughed when I saw it. The same man who had lived off my parents' entire life, who had spent the money from my house on a vacation, now thought he had the moral high ground. But I didn't care anymore. For years, I had been treated as if I was disposable, like my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. My grandmother was the only one who made me feel like I mattered. And her house was her final gift to me. My father tried to steal that. Tried to erase the one thing I had that meant something. And he failed. Now, he was about to lose everything. He would likely have to sell his house to pay off his debts. Adam would be left with nowhere to live. My mother, who had always taken his side, would have to decide whether to support him or let him sink. And me? I was fine. For the first time, I felt at peace. I have no regrets. If I could go back in time, I would do it all over again. If I had to take my family to court again, I wouldn't hesitate. Because I finally learned the lesson I should have understood long ago. Family means nothing when they don't treat you like family. And I don't owe them anything. The news that my father would have to pay not only me but also the buyers was the final blow. He tried to appeal. Tried to argue that it had all been a misunderstanding. Even played the victim in front of the judge. But the truth was undeniable. Not only had he committed fraud, he had deceived both parties. And in the end, justice prevailed. The final ruling ordered him to pay a substantial compensation both to me and to the former buyers. The amount was so high that he couldn't cover it with what he had. And, as expected, he had no choice but to sell his own house. It was a humiliating process. He tried everything to avoid it. By all means possible, he even tried to transfer the house to someone else's name to hide his assets. But Daniel anticipated it and made sure that wouldn't happen. With no way out, my father had no choice but to put the house up for sale. Ironically, the home where he and my mother lived ended up in the hands of strangers, just like he had tried to do with my house. My mother had a breakdown. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the consequences of what they had done. She tried calling me several times, but I never answered. There was nothing left to say. When they finally moved out, my father ended up in a small apartment in a much more modest neighborhood, far from the luxury he was used to. My mother followed him because, in the end, she had always been his accomplice. Adam, on the other hand, was in complete denial. He had never worked, never taken on responsibilities, and now, suddenly, he was homeless and without the allowance he had always received. The day everything was settled, he had the audacity to come find me. "You're a bastard," he spat angrily. "You destroyed our family over an old house." I laughed, but not out of joy. It was a bitter laugh. The kind that comes when you finally understand the sheer stupidity of the person in front of you. "I destroyed our family?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Because I had no choice? Because while you were spoiled and protected, I had to fend for myself? Grandma was the only one who ever truly cared about me, and you all tried to steal the only thing I had left." He rolled his eyes. "Oh, please. Don't start with your drama." I stepped closer and spoke in a firm voice. "Listen to me, Adam, because this is the last time we will ever speak. You're a parasite. You've spent your entire life living off mom and dad without lifting a finger to achieve anything. But now, they have nothing left to give you. And I don't owe you anything." For the first time, he was speechless. "You want to know how this ends?" I continued. "Dad will spend the rest of his life bitter and ruined. Mom will keep pretending none of this was her fault. And you? You'll have to figure out how to survive on your own. Good luck with that." Then I simply turned around and walked away. I never looked back. In the months that followed, I heard a few updates. My father tried to re-enter the workforce but couldn't find a job that would allow him to maintain the lifestyle he once had. My mother, unsure of what to do, started taking on odd jobs just to make ends meet. Their house was gone. Their luxuries were gone. And for the first time in their lives, they truly knew what it was like to lose everything. Adam tried asking other relatives for help, but no one wanted to take him in. He ended up sharing an apartment with 2 acquaintances. And for the first time in his life, he had to find a job. At first, he complained that I had ruined his life. But when reality finally hit him, he understood that he had to grow up. And me? I moved on. I stayed in my house and rebuilt my life. No regrets. No guilt. I cut ties with my family. And for the first time ever, I felt free. Because I finally learned something valuable. Family isn't defined by blood. Family is defined by respect. And those 3? They were never really my family. I never looked back. And I never needed to.